Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today I figured I'd explain the idea of a thermal bottleneck. So here's my grossly simplified model of a CPU die and some Intel toothpaste. So we'll just skip the Intel part because that takes too long to write. Then we have an IHS. So let's get that there. Then we have some real thermal paste, so let's just put thermal interface material and a heat sink or a water cooler or something, okay? And, yeah, water cooler, right? So either or. And let's say our CPU is kicking out 100 watts of heat. And we have an ambient temperature of 25, and we're just going to say that our ambient is 25 degrees centigrade. There, and I'm not, well, there. Okay, and now the cool thing is that each of these different parts of our cooling system has a certain thermal resistance. So let's say our CPU die, it's not going to be as conductive as the IHS because it's made of silicon, but it's still going to be pretty thermally conductive. So we're going to say that that's going to be like, and none of these numbers are, these numbers aren't supposed to be real. Well, they aren't real, but I'm trying to not put them like way out in fantasy land, but they're they're not something you should actually like go like, yeah, this is what you really end up with. No. But they're not completely off the deep end either. So let's say that's like 50 watts per degree centigrade. Then we have the toothpaste, which might be like 20 watts per degree centigrade. Then we have our IHS, which might be like 100 watts, because that's just a straight block of copper with some nickel plating on it. That's not going to do anything like thermally. It's not going to offer much thermal impedance whatsoever, or thermal resistance whatsoever. Then we have our thermal interface material, which is going to be slightly better than the toothpaste, so we're going to put that at 25 watts per degree. And then we're finally going to have our heat sink, which, because this has to dump the heat into the air, and air is kind of garbage at actually carrying away heat, just because, and like you always end up, dumping your heat into the air. The water cooler just has a, well, actually, even like a heat pipe heat sink has an intermediate stage where the heat pipe has a transfer fluid inside it. The water cooler has water inside it, or a glycol mixture, which is probably mostly water anyway, inside it, and that will ultimately then go into some kind of fin stack that dumps the heat into the air. And the air kind of sucks at that, so we're going to put this at 10 watts per degree centigrade. So with all of these values, we can actually just calculate the temperature of our CPU die here. So we know that we are dissipating 100 watts because the CPU is putting out 100 watts of heat, and it's not shutting down on us because it's overheating. So we know at least that it's not thermally overloaded right now. So first we have the CPU die, which has a 50 watts per degree centigrade thermal resistance, which basically means that for every degree of temperature rise, we get 50 watts of thermal dissipation. So that means across the thickness of the die, we're going to see a 2 degree temperature, 2 degree centigrade, 2 degree difference. And I'm just going to put a 2 there, and I'm going to make it smaller so that we have space. And I really did not think this through with the toothpaste and the Tim stripe, did I? Whatever. The toothpaste is 20 watts per degree centigrade, so that's going to give us a temperature rise of 5. The IHS is 100 watts per degree centigrade, so that's going to give us a temperature rise of 1. Then we have our thermal paste, which is better than the toothpaste, but not that much, so it's going to be only 4 degrees per watt. And then finally we get our heat sink, which is going to have our 10 watts per degree centigrade. We're pumping 100 watts into it, so that's going to mean we're going to have a 10 degree thermal rise across that. And from this, we can very easily figure out what CPU temperature we're at, because we just go 25, which is ambient, plus 10, plus 4, plus 1, plus 5, plus 2, right? And that works out to... okay, wait, that's 22 total on there. It's 25. So that gives us 47 degrees centigrade. That's not bad. But what if? What if we start overclocking our CPU and our power consumption goes from 100 watts to 200 watts? Well, our thermal resistances haven't changed, so what's going to end up happening, and I am actually cheating this because if you had a heat pipe heatsink, your thermal resistance actually changes quite significantly if you exceed the thermal transfer capabilities of your heat pipes. Because past a certain point, heat pipes basically just stop. Like, you try to push more heat through a heat pipe than it's rated for, and it basically doesn't work at all. Like, you can't do that. It'll just basically, it'll sort of hit a, like, well, basically your thermal resistance for a heat pipe cooler will look something like this. So you're gonna, like, if this is wattage, then actually no, if this is wattage, then this is degree centigrade. So, you know, the heat pipes might max out. If you have like a five heat pipe heatsink, you can get like 50-watt rated heat pipes. If you have 5 of those heat pipes in your heatsink, once you exceed 250 watts of heat dissipation, it's going to be really hard to get any more heat dissipation out of that heatsink, because those heat pipes are literally not capable of transferring 50 watts through their main transfer mechanism, and you'll just be relying on the thermal conductivity of the copper making them up, which is garbage compared to what the transfer fluid inside them is capable of doing. But you kind of don't have a choice after you maxed out the thermal capacity of a heat pipe. So that's why you'll see like a lot of coolers with like why the high-end air coolers, they'll have like a lot of heat pipes and then the double towers and that kind of thing, because it's not just like they combine both. Like, you need a lot of surface area, and then you need a lot of heat pipes, because they do have a thermal transfer limit. Now, water cooling doesn't really run into that issue, but we're not going to go into the details of that. Anyway, we're going to just ignore all the complications of that part. And we're just going to ignore all that, and we're just going to act like all of our thermal resistances stay the same, because I still want to explain the thermal bottleneck idea. So we've gone up to 200 watts heat dissipation. So now our temperature rise across the CPU die goes from 2 degrees to 4. Our toothpaste now starts lifting our final temperature by 10 degrees. Our IHS does it by 2. Our real thermal paste does it by 8. And our heatsink does it by 20. And so now we're getting like pretty high temperatures, because we're going to be at 25 plus 20 plus 8 plus 2 plus 10. This is actually working all very nicely for me in terms of the math. So we have 10. Okay, so we have like 44 degrees there, plus 25. And we get 69 degrees centigrade on the CPU. So that's not too bad. But let's say, you know, this is actually like a Phenom 2, and we've just exceeded like the safe max temperature, which is like 65 degrees centigrade. Which AMD doesn't make the Phenom 2s with toothpaste under the IHS, but let's just say this is a special case and it has toothpaste, okay? Because otherwise this is not going to work. So we want to get the temperature back down to... we want to start working the temperature down, and we could start upgrading the heatsink, right? And we're going to get to the thermal bottleneck very quickly. So our initial upgrade, we might go from a 10 watts per degree centigrade heatsink to a 20 watt per degree per degree heatsink, and that's all very well and good. So now our temperature increase across the heatsink goes from 20 degrees to just 10. Which means that in this equation we had down here, we just cross that out, replace that with 10, and we now end up with 34 plus 25. And now our temperatures are back to being very, very acceptable. We're at 59 degrees centigrade. That's great. But I still want to keep cranking up that heatsink. Let's just keep upgrading that heatsink and see what starts happening. So next big jump, we go to a 50 watt heats. We go to a because this is let's say 33 point. All right, no, I'm not. Is that a bad idea? It's not a bad idea, is it? Wait, 20. Wait, that's 200. Okay, no, that's fine. It's fine. I'm trying to keep the math simple for myself, if you haven't noticed. So 200, we're going to go from 10 degrees thermal rise to 6 degrees. And so we just knocked 2 more degrees, but we had to pick up 13 watts. Like, we had to lower You know, we had a 13 watt heat dissipation upgrade to our heatsink. Like, that's pretty significant, right? And so now we're going down, 6 degrees, and well, we now are hitting like 55 degrees centigrade, which is like really, really good. Keep upgrading the heatsink. 40 watts. So now we're going to go from 6 degrees to 5 degrees, and we're going to go from 55 to 54C, and you can kind of see how this is starting to roll off. More. We can go more. We go to 50 watts per degree centigrade. We're now like completely, hitting the limits of. So we're gonna now have 4 degrees across the heatsink, 53 degrees. Like this is getting us nowhere, right? The temperature isn't really changing that much. Keep upgrading the heatsink. Let's just do 1, 2, skip a few, 100 watts. Okay, this is some crazy cooling system we got here. Soon enough, we're going to be on a water cooler where the water inside the loop is actually at room temperature. And unfortunately, our temperature is not going to get much better, which is the point I'm trying to make here. So we're now on a 100 watt heatsink, so we only have 2 degrees of temperature, 2 degrees of temperature rise across the cooling system instead of 4. Our CPU temperature is still 51 degrees centigrade. Okay, so now we completely max out our cooling system. We have a 200 watt per degree centigrade water cooler. Okay? There is 1 degree of thermal rise across our heatsink. The end result is we are now at 50 degrees centigrade. Incredible. Absolutely an achievement, but I want the temperature to go lower. So we go from our 240 millimeter AIO to a 480 millimeter, to like a 480 millimeter custom loop, right? That's gonna fix our thermal problem. I want the CPU back at 47 degrees centigrade, right? Well, 400 watts per degree centigrade, and we're not getting anywhere because 0.5. So we're now at 49.5 C. And I think at this point, you probably get the idea. The problem is that, yes, our heatsink, our cooling system keeps getting better and better and better and better. But the main bottleneck in our cooling system at this point isn't the heatsink. It hasn't been a bottleneck for a while. We have 8 degrees of temperature delta across our first layer of thermal paste, and then the toothpaste is adding 10 degrees of temperature to our cooling system. So this is why delidding is a thing, because if you can eliminate things like the toothpaste, and like let's say we upgrade the both of our thermal interface materials, but mostly we just get rid of the toothpaste. Like, let's just say we only got rid of the toothpaste and replaced it with the same thermal paste we used on the other side of the heatsink. Well, we go from that 20 to 25 watts, which, let's see, I'm going to just say toothpaste. We just get rid of the toothpaste, and we start using Tim there as well. We go from 10 degrees to 8 degrees, and bam, we now drop, 2 degrees, because we are now gaining 2 degrees less across that part of the cooling system. But we can go further. We could replace the thermal paste with liquid metal, and let's say liquid metal has 50 watts per degree centigrade. And let's put liquid metal everywhere. Though, personally, I'm not a fan of liquid metal. It makes a horrific mess, in my opinion. But let's say we go liquid metal everywhere. So we have 50 watts per degree centigrade on both sides now, right? So we replace we go to liquid metal now. And so now our thermal gain here is 4 degrees, our thermal gain there is 4 degrees, and, we just knocked off 8 degrees off our CPU temperature with a thermal paste swap. This is not actually realistic for the most part, but, you get the idea here. The heatsink was just like, you very quickly, because here's what was happening, right? The heat from the CPU was, all the heat that made it to the heatsink was basically gone immediately. It was immediately removed by our ridiculously overkill water cooling system. And the problem was that in like basically all of our temperature gain was across the interface from the die to the water cooler, right? Across those two layers of thermal paste and the IHS, we were picking up basically all of the temperature difference because the water cooler was as cold as it could possibly be. It wasn't really going to get any better. Of course, if you had a sub-zero cooling system, then you could just start like you would basically artificially crank up your temperature delta, but which would make the efficiency better. But we're not going to go into that. Well, basically, if you had a negative system, if you basically have a sub-zero, like you can go sub-ambient, you just take off that temperature out of the system. You can just kind of, just consider it minus temperature, just straight minus. But anyway, so we replace our thermal paste and, we get a nice big 8-degree temperature drop from a thermal paste upgrade here. But it can get better, an alternative solution would be, let's say we don't want to use liquid metal, we still want to rely on our good old thermal, just regular old thermal paste. Well, if we just eliminated, right, let's go back a bit more. Back a bit more. Okay, no, that's a bit too far. Okay, so we're on our toothpaste, right? It's 20 watts per degree centigrade. We're on the thermal, we're on the 25 watts per C TIM. Well, what if we just, didn't have an IHS and didn't have the toothpaste? That's minus 12 degrees right there. Right? That's literally minus 12 degrees by removing our thermal paste and the IHS. Gone. That is no longer a thermal bottleneck. We've just dropped 12 degrees. And that's actually more effective than the upgrade to the liquid metal on both sides, because if you remember, the liquid metal on both sides was doing 4-degree gain across both, and then there was still that 2-degree gain across the 2-degree thermal rise across the IHS. So that was still plus 10 degrees, whereas with just thermal paste straight to the die, you're getting plus 8 degrees instead of plus 10. So this is the idea of the thermal bottleneck. And I'm bringing this up because I've seen a lot of situations on forums and Reddit where, people have, say, they have a 7700K. Well, not a 7700Ks are rare because deleting is kind of mainstream now, but 6700K, right? Or a 4790K. One of the, before deleting became really, really common. So you'd have one of these CPUs, and you'd have people just cramming steadily bigger and bigger and bigger water cooling loops onto these CPUs and wondering why the temperatures aren't going down. It's because your water loop cannot remove heat that isn't getting to it. Okay? That's the idea of the thermal bottleneck. If you have a pile of junk thermal paste and an IHS and a bunch of silicon, and then more thermal paste, and then finally your water loop, it doesn't matter that your water is at room temperature, okay? You can't get more cooling done unless you start going below zero, or you just get rid of the thermal bottlenecks of the thermal paste and the IHS. Now, admittedly, running direct die is actually very, very rare, but just replacing the stock Intel toothpaste with liquid metal makes a huge difference. As I'm sure you're all aware of, that's been very well documented. And the reason why it makes such a huge difference is because you are eliminating, especially this was just 200 watts. But if we were on a 400 watt CPU, our temperature rise across the toothpaste wouldn't be 10 degrees. It'd be 20, right? And if you went from your 20 watt per degree centigrade toothpaste to, say, 25 watt, which 25, the 25 watt stuff would give you a 4-degree drop at 400 watts load, right? Because you would go for 25 watts, you would go to 16 degrees delta. And if you go all the way to the, say we upgraded to something weaker than the ridiculous liquid metal I was describing, which was 50 watts per degree, which actually I don't think any of these numbers are particularly realistic. Just keep that in mind. But let's say we upgraded to a thermal paste that wasn't 50 watts like before, but just 40. Right? That would go from 20 to, this would start getting us a 10-degree temperature rise across the thermal paste layer. So you'd basically have a 10-degree temperature drop just because you can now pass 400 watts of heat with a 10-degree lower thermal delta, right? Because you need that thermal difference to get your heat, to get your thermal throughput. right? Heat spreads faster the bigger the temperature difference between like the cold and the hot thing is. So yeah, which is why subambient like water cooling systems and that kind of thing would actually get around like the thermal bottle, like the toothpaste, because you know, if you're if because basically your heat sink is going to get steadily closer and closer to room temperature, right? So it's going to be like 25 C, or in the, you know, with the 400 watt per degree centigrade cooling system, and let's say at our 400 watt heat output CPU, the water cooler would be at 26 degrees centigrade, right? It would be like 1 degree above ambient. So, like, throwing more cooling here doesn't do anything because we can't go below ambient unless we get some kind of active cooling system like phase change or Peltiers or something to get the water temperature lower. And if you get the temperature lower, right, if you go from 26 to, say, 16 degrees on the water cooler, well, that's minus 10 degrees for everything before it, right? Like, basically what you've done is you've moved your, basically what it looks like is if you took all of our previous calculations and took the, like, say the very, well, let's just do an updated one, right? So right now we're going to say toothpaste with thermal paste with an IHS, the most ridiculous cooling system, but, well, let's just write those out. So we're going to go 25 ambient, plus 1, because, you know, that's the H2O. Then we're going to go plus 8 for the thermal paste, because we've not upgraded that. And that's at 400 watts, right? And we're going to go plus 4 for the IHS, because the IHS is 100 watts per degree centigrade. Plus, what was it, 20? Yeah, plus 20. Wait, what? 8? I'm dumb. Plus 16. Plus 20. And plus 8. Because, of course, our dye also adds thermal resistance. So this is going to run really hot, as you can clearly see, because we're ramming 400 watts of heat into this. And that 400 watts is being stalled on our thermal paste and IHS situation. But if we go sub-zero, we can actually, like, well, if we go sub-ambient, we can sort of cheat that. So we're going to be 25 plus 1 plus, okay, so we're at 25 plus 1 plus 16, so that's what, these two are 20. 49 plus 25, that's about, what's that? That's 69, 74. There, so we end up at 74 degrees CPU temperature. That's really not that bad, but that's, again, ridiculously overkill. Well, that's mostly because of the ridiculous cooling system. Of course, if we keep cranking up the heat output, this part of the equation won't grow as fast as these, and we can quickly get into the 90s. And this is actually unrealistic. I've never seen a 400 watt CPU running at 74C. So these numbers are obviously like the thermal paste, and like everything after the water loop is a bit too good. And I think even the water loop is a, well, no, you could build a water loop like that. You could. If you just put enough radiator on the problem, you can definitely get it to 1 degree above ambient on the water. But yeah, so we end up at 74C. Now, of course, if you just go with a sub-ambient cooling system, then you basically go 25 minus 10, right? If you can run 10 degrees below ambient, you go minus 10, and then you add on all of the good old part that sucks anyway. Then you do plus 40, plus 48, and you end up at a acceptable temperature without having to get rid of the thermal paste, because you're effectively cheating your ambient temperature. Because, well, yeah, it's not really cheating the ambient temperature. It's basically you're shifting the temperatures down, but the deltas are staying the same. So, yeah, that's why sub-ambient is, like, pretty freaking awesome. And actually, the last option, like, at some point, you know, you're not gonna, like, at some point, the thermal resistance of the CPU die itself is gonna be so high that you just need to go below, like below room temperature in order to get it any cooler. Though that tends to be like that's what liquid nitrogen is for, basically. So yeah, I hope this clears some stuff, explains some well, I don't know, clarifies some stuff about cooling systems for people. Basically, if you have a water cooling system, right, or any kind of cooling system, and you keep throwing bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger heat sinks at the problem, there's gonna be a point where you're gonna run into the issue that the problem is not your heatsink. It's everything between your heatsink and the thing you're trying to cool, like the thermal paste, like the IHS. And that's the idea of basically the thermal bottleneck. That and actually, if you eliminated things like the IHS, you could downgrade the cooler because like you wouldn't need as much crazy, like, because here's the thing: if we eliminate, right, in this example, if I eliminate all of the like the thermal paste and the IHS here, right, if we just threw all of that out and then I downgraded the cooling system, well, we went from a 400 watt to a 100 watt cooling system, which actually I can't throw out all the thermal pastes. One of the thermal pastes has to stay, but you could do like a 25 plus 4 plus 16, and then this 4 plus 20 could be gone because you remove the IHS and the thermal paste under the IHS and you run direct dye. Well, you end up with 25 plus 4 plus 16, which is suddenly, again, just 45 degrees, which is bloody great. Like, that's incredible temperatures right there. So, yeah, especially for 400 watts heat dissipation. But again, the problem here in the cooling system was not the water cooler. It was the thermal paste and the IHS. And that's, I think at this point I've beaten this to death, haven't I? Video is 27 minutes long, so I should probably pack it up. Yeah. So, I don't know how, like, we all know I suck at outros, so I guess like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below or a question if you have any. What else is there? If you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, as well as I kind of want to go to Computex this year, and I kind of don't have the budget to do that, so it would be hugely helpful if you all could, like, check out the link down in the description below to things like the shirts, the Patreon, and like the PayPal donate, the PayPal link that you can send money through, because yeah, I need to get to Computex is in Taiwan, and the trip is gonna cost like $2,200 for the whole thing, and there's no, like, currently the AHOC budget is not covering that, even like remotely, and I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna need some extra help, like more help than usual, because normally the Patreon funding is not gonna, like, the usual Patreon funding is not gonna cover Computex. So yeah, this is like the only way to guarantee that I get there. I am obviously looking for some kind of alternative way of getting it funded, but like, no guarantees, right? This channel's kind of small. I don't think I'll get picked up by some huge brand to cover my expensive trip to Computex. So yeah, it would really be great if you all helped out with that. And yeah, that's it for the video. Thank you for watching, and see you all next time.